Good morning. This is Thursday, April 30th, 2020. Today we're going to be looking at a little bit longer passage. It's Isaiah chapter 56, verse 9 through 57, verse 13. Here God is renewing his complaint against the children of Israel. When we were going through the earlier chapters of this book, that was back several months ago before we did this online, we had noted that God was going back and forth between declaring judgment and promising hope. The last several chapters that we've been looking at have focused on the suffering servant and the related passages that we've just finished. And the focus has been on God's promise of a future Messiah who would come and set things right. But here in these verses, God returns again to his complaints against the nation of Israel. So I'm not going to read the whole passage. I'm going to pick out a few phrases that'll give you a kind of a flavor of what God was complaining about, the people about, and what the kind of things they were doing. So in chapter 56, verse 10, he says, Israel's watchmen are blind. They all lack knowledge. The priests and the prophets were supposed to be the watchmen to warn the people when they began to stray from God's will. Here he says they're blind. How can they watch if they're blind? He calls them mute dogs that cannot bark. Not only are they blind, but they're also mute. If they do sense danger, they have no way to alert the people. In verse 11, he calls them shepherds who lack understanding. In his third allegation, he calls them shepherds who don't know what's going on. Again, this points an accusing finger at the religious leaders who were supposed to guard and guide the people. He says they've all turned to their own way. They seek their own gain. Instead of warning and guarding and guiding the people, they were just seeking to better themselves, to get rich. Chapter 57, verse 4 says, Are you not a brood of rebels? All the people are rebelling against God. They perverted his truths. In verse 6, he says, To idols you have poured out drink offerings and offered grain offerings. Instead of making offerings to God, they're making offerings to the false gods of that time. In verse 8, he says, Forsaking me, you made a pact with those whose beds you love. In verse 9, you went to Moloch with olive oil and increased your perfumes. Moloch was a false god of that day, to which people would actually offer their own children as gruesome sacrifices. Verse 10 says, You wearied yourself by such going about. In other words, all their running around has worn them out. They're exhausted, but still they do not turn to him. So God says in chapter 57, verse 6, In view of all this, should I relent? In other words, God asks if they can give him a reason why he should show them kindness. Then he resolves in verse 13, When you cry out for help, let your collection of idols save you. The wind will carry them all off. A mere breath will blow them away. Altogether, some pretty tough allegations. And we know from other accounts that it was indeed as bad as the prophet said. And God did bring punishment. Babylon did come and destroy the city, and the people were carried away into captivity. And from this passage, we get a sense of God's frustration over his people. Why didn't they just obey? That's an important question for us. Why don't we just obey? Every now and again, we need to review these prophetic accounts and ask ourselves if God is not only speaking to the nation of Israel 700 years before the birth of Jesus, but maybe he's talking to us as well. It's an important question. Where do you fit into this account? Where do I fit into this account? Before we leave this passage, though, I just want to point out a couple verses that I skipped, I think they're really significant. Take a look at chapter 57, verses 1 and 2. There they say, chapter 57, verse 1, the righteous perish, and no one takes it into heart. The devout are taken away, and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil. Those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death. We're conditioned to see death as defeat. Here, God suggests that in his mercy, in order to spare the righteous from the hurt of evil, he sometimes takes them home early. Can you accept that? Yes, life is sacred, and we should do all we can to protect it. But at the same time, death is not the end. It's not defeat. For anyone who has received Jesus Christ as their Savior, death is the doorway to a much better place. God concludes this section with the promise of chapter 57, verse 13, where it says, "Whoever takes refuge in me will inherit the land and possess my holy mountain." We don't always understand what God has planned for us. Can't always explain what's going on around us, but we can trust God's goodness and his love. Those who remain faithful to him will inherit his kingdom. And that is a beautiful thought. I hope today, as we face the difficulties, the trials, the fears of this world, that you will find comfort in the Lord, our Savior. God bless you all today.